Somewhere between cartoons and backyard fences, we grew up believing that cats and dogs were born to feud. Claws versus teeth, fur against fur. Tom always chasing, Spike always barking. It's a rivalry etched into the corners of our memory, like an old comic strip we've read too many times. Even Garfield and Odie, that cranky orange monarch, and his tongue-lolling sidekick, taught us that felines were the brains, and dogs were the permanent punchlines. But then again, the world has always made room for exceptions. There are oddities that don't fit into the neat boxes our stories draw. Sometimes, friendships come in strange shapes and sizes, and sometimes they walk side by side toward the mailbox every morning while the birds gossip in the trees overhead. Because once in a while, you meet a dog who refuses to eat unless a cat gives him permission. This story isn't famous. You won't find it in an old newspaper clipping or a viral post with 10 million shares. It happened quietly, in a place where wind chimes hummed and lilac bushes leaned over white fences in the spring. Upstate New York, a neighborhood where mailmen waved from their trucks and kids biked home before dark. A place where quiet things unfolded without being noticed. And in the middle of all this was a dog named Baxter. He was small, wiry, and the color of old dishwater, the kind of mutt that needed a second glance to be called cute. His eyes were dark, like polished marbles, and always seemed to be apologizing for something. His ears flopped, but not in a charming way, more like they were unsure of their role on his head. He didn't bark, hardly played, was terrified of almost everything that moved, be it plastic bag or a passing breeze. Baxter had learned somewhere along the way that the world was a little too loud, a little too fast, and entirely not meant for him. But he had one gift. He watched, closely, quietly, looking from corners with those big eyes, cataloging every leaf that fell out of place. His foster mom, Teresa, said he had the soul of an antique book, weathered, quiet, waiting for someone who would read between the lines. She meant it as a compliment, even if Baxter didn't know what books were, let alone what a soul was. Still, he waited, listened, observed. And then there was the cat, Eloise. She arrived on a Tuesday, in the kind of dusty, musky carrier that cats somehow always emerge from offended. She didn't meow. She didn't hiss. She simply uttered out like she'd just leased the place. Baxter didn't know what to make of her. She was everything he wasn't. Large, confident, unbothered by noise, by space, by human hands. While he melted into furniture to avoid being petted, Eloise would press her side boldly into any warm lap. While he flinched from sudden footsteps, Eloise strolled into rooms like she was auditing them. She was tabby-striped, with a permanent smugness and eyes that looked bored with the universe. And from that very first hour, from the moment her paws touched the laminated floor, Baxter watched her like a storm he'd been warned about, but didn't understand. Eloise, for her part, didn't watch him at all. Not yet. Baxter didn't always have a name, much less someone to say it like it mattered. Before Teresa, before porches and soft blankets, there was only noise and shadows. He'd been taken from a house that housed too many animals and not enough kindness. The hoarder had meant well, maybe, but meaning well doesn't make up for a cracked food bowls and the constant, aching feeling of being forgotten. When authorities came, he didn't bark or run. He simply curled deeper into the corner, ears pressed back, eyes wide. They had to lift him with glove. It's not because he bit, but because he trembled so hard they feared he'd fall apart. In his first foster home, the woman cried when she met him, said he looked like a rejected teddy bear. She tried to coax him out with soft food, and lullabies played on her phone. It worked for a while. Then her own dog barked once too loudly, and Baxter didn't come back out from under the couch for 3 days. Placement number 2 was quieter. No other animals, just a young man with an apartment that smelled like coffee and newly painted walls. But the sounds outside, elevator dings, footsteps heavy on hallway carpets, doors, slamming, sent Baxter into a spiral. The man adored him. Baxter feared everything else. Teresa was the last call they made. A woman known among rescuers for taking on the hopeless cases, the ones who didn't shake fear off with a game of fetch, the ones who needed time like others need food. She agreed without hesitation. He arrived in the back seat of a borrowed van, eyes never blinking, curled into a silent coma the whole ride. Teresa didn't reach for him right away. She simply sat on the porch steps and let the warm breeze do the talking. For weeks, he barely left his corner. She didn't push. She moved slow, lie, spoke even more slowly. She'd sprinkle treats in paths, like breadcrumbs in the quiet fairy tale he'd never heard. He began to eat, bit by bit, inch by inch, and one day, 2 whole months in, he lay down in the living room and fell asleep with his feet not tucked beneath him for the very first time. Then came Eloise. She was the kind of animal who arrived with her own pre-written biography, raised by a college professor with a taste for jazz records and microwave dinners. Eloise had been passed back to the shelter when her person took a job abroad. Not good with change, the intake form warned, as if the CEO, Tati herself, had written it. She didn't appreciate new boxes or new routines. But once she claimed a space, and she always did, she treated it like it had belonged to her in a past life. She was plump, but in a queenly way. Not lazy, just above petty movement. She preferred rooftops to floors, windowsills to laps. Occasionally, she'd go on long strolls on her own, meandering up neighborhood paths, inspecting other people's porches like an HOA officer in fur. Her whiskers twitched like lie detectors. Her gaze held the patience of someone who'd seen centuries pass and remained unimpressed. When Teresa took her in, it wasn't from charity. It was because they understood each other. Eloise entered the house, found the warmest patch of carpet, and sat down like it had already been paid for. She wasn't rude to Teresa. She simply accepted her presence as decor. For a week, neither cat nor dog acknowledged the other. They orbited the same rooms, never colliding. Baxter largely kept to himself. Eloise ignored nearly everything, including food preferences. Except, sometimes she paused. From her perch on the armrest or atop the dryer, she'd slow blink in Baxter's direction, not affectionately, more professionally, like accounts. Ill woman assessing a stranger in her district. Baxter would freeze under her glance, unsure if he was being cursed or knighted. Their habits, so jarringly different, created a rhythm of opposites. He'd skitter at the sound of the back door. She'd strut through it. He'd sink behind the recliner at sudden laughter. She'd inspect the source. He watched her nap like it was a masterclass in comfort. She, in turn, seemed to take no interest at all, except that she never sat where he sat first. never blocked his path, never hissed or batted a paw. They were co-inhabitants, roommates under a single-story detente. Still, Teresa noticed something. On days that Eloise climbed into the same room as Baxter, he rested easier. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something quieter, a tolerance shaped like a question mark, an invisible thread beginning to stretch, not tight, not knotted, just gently, curiously, connecting one quiet animal to another, and neither of them quite knew what to do with it yet. Baxter didn't eat. Teresa tried everything. Kibble mixed with wet food, frozen raw medallions gently thawed and hand-served, even human-grade treats that smelled like actual beef stew. He sniffed, licked once, and turned his head awe. It wasn't about the flavor. Not really. It was the act itself. Loud, vulnerable, exposed. Eating meant you believed you'd still be safe 12 seconds from now. Baxter wasn't there yet. She moved his bowl to quieter places. Next to the couch, under the laundry rack. He still wouldn't budge. That's when Eloise made a decision. It wasn't announced, of course. She didn't raise a paw or flick an ear in intention. All Teresa saw that first morning was the cat strolling casually into the kitchen during breakfast. She sniffed her food, gave it an approving nod, and began eating with contented crunches. Baxter, Ducky, Dee nearby in a corner, watched. He didn't eat immediately, but when Eloise finished and sat licking her paw within his view, he cautiously tip-pawed to his bowl, sniffed, took a mouthful. The next morning, the same thing. Eloise appeared, on time and unbothered, like royalty inspecting her manor before breakfast. Only then, as if some unwritten permission had passed through the room, did Baxter eat. It was slow, tense even, but certain. By day 4, it was ritual. Eloise entered first, surveyed the space, began eating. Baxter waited, didn't blink, until her first crunch. On day 5, Eloise paused before starting, looked directly at Baxter, one long slow blink, just once, and only then lowered her head to eat. That day, Baxter finished his entire bowl. From then on, it became clear. Baxter didn't just watch the cat. He felt something from her. A cue, a conviction, a kind of gravity that tethered his nerves. Teresa didn't interfere. She started announcing breakfast, like she ran a B&B instead of a foster house. "Your table is ready, Miss Eloise. Your guest awaits." Eloise would blink, flick her tail, and take her place as the bizarre maître d' of mealtime. One morning, after breakfast, Eloise made her way toward the sliding dew. Or, she liked the sun and the rustle of birds. She had her favorite corner on the back porch. As she walked, Baxter rose, not quickly, not as a bolt, but like someone following a half-remembered invitation. Teresa watched, still as branches in low wind. Eloise pushed through the flap. Baxter paused, then followed, one hesitant paw after the other. What followed was nothing short of absurd. Eloise strolled along the grass, tail pointed and head held high. Baxter trailed behind, not beside, not leashed, just following, eyes steady on her path. He moved easier behind her, as if her certainty paved the way for his fear. To stay tucked quietly behind, Teresa stifled a laugh, then filmed it. In the video, you can see it. The cat, regal as a duchess on her morning rounds. The scruffy little terrier trailing behind like a fuzzy footman. No leash, no commands. Just a silent agreement between two animals who apparently understood something the rest of the world didn't. It wasn't a one-time fluke. Every day afterward, Eloise walked, and Baxter followed, never past the end of the yard, not until she went there, never into the flower beds, unless she stepped in first. And if Eloise stopped to sniff a leaf, Baxter waited behind her, as if needing her analysis before forming his own opinion. One day, Teresa tried letting Baxter out first. He froze at the door, looked back, waited. Only when Eloise sauntered across the threshold did he step outside. It was comical, yes, but also oddly touching. These weren't playmates. They didn't wrestle or chase. They barely touched at all. But somehow, the presence of one made the other more complete, even if they'd never admit it. And Eloise? She never strutted too far, never tried to shake the little shadow tailing her. She'd pause now and then, let him catch up, sit in the dappled shade of the fence just long, enough to let Baxter sit too. Occasionally, she'd flick her tail against his foot, like an afterthought, and he'd jump, then settle. That's how they went, cat leading, dog trusting. Not once did Baxter look back. His eyes followed her, always just her, because somewhere along the line, the cat had become the dog's compass. It started with a walk, not the usual kind, with leashes and wagging tails, poop bags rustling from coat pockets. No, this walk was orchestrated, not by the person holding the leash, but by the cat who simply refused not to be involved. Teresa, trying to ease Baxter into a routine, started morning walks again, tentative circles around the backyard at first, then little loops around the block. She clipped the leash onto Baxter's harness, offered him a tiny, high-pitched, "Let's go, buddy," and did her best not to overwhelm his fragile confidence. But halfway through their first loop, Eloise appeared. It wasn't like she'd been invited, but there she was, at the edge of the porch, tail upright, eyes narrowed, like she was inspecting a parade she didn't remember authorizing. Without hesitation, she stepped off the porch, trotted ahead of Teresa and Baxter, and walked, not beside, ahead, and to Teresa's asked astonishment, Baxter followed. No pulling, no freezing. His tail didn't wag, but it also didn't tuck. He simply walked, gaze fixed on the swaying tip of Eloise's tail, as if it were leading him through fog. By the third day of this ritual, people started noticing. The Jensen twins across the street pointed and laughed. "Mom, look, that dog's following a cat," their voices gleeful and echoing. Old Mr. Delacroix next door asked if the leash laws had changed, because if not, I think your cat's violating at least 3 of them. Even the mailman paused one morning, arm balancing bundles of flyers and bills, and said, "I've seen dogs walk cats before, sure, but I've never seen a cat lead a dog like it owed her rent." Teresa didn't know how to answer. She usually just smiled and said, "They've got it worked out." But the questions kept coming. One kid on a scooter asked, "Is the dog adopted? Or did the cat hire him?" An elderly woman with a Yorkie declared it was unnatural and that the dog looked hypnotized. Sometimes Baxter would stop mid-walk and stare at Eloise, waiting patiently as she inspected something invisible on a curb. If she darted under a bush, he'd freeze, like someone pulled the plug on his motor. One time, he refused to move for almost 10 minutes. No treat or tug could persuade him. Teresa finally found Eloise crouching under a rose bush, tail flicking in mild annoyance, the moment she stepped out. Baxter stood, shook off the delay like it was just weather, and kept walking. And at least once, a neighbor called animal control. They didn't come officially, just knocked on Teresa's door, mildly confused. "We got a report that a cat might be stealing someone's dog," the officer said, trying not to laugh. Eloise watched from the top of the couch, as if evaluating the stats of this new visitor. Baxter peeked from around the corner, not scared, not alarmed, just waiting. For the next cue? For her signal. Teresa explained, patiently, that both animals belonged to her, that neither was trained to do this, that she hadn't taught her cat to be anyone's emotional seeing eye animal. "But he won't walk unless she does?" the officer asked. "She's the GPS," Teresa replied. The officer chuckled and left with a shrug. But the neighborhood curiosity didn't fade. 2 streets over, people began referring to them as the Duchess and her guardian. Photos circulated on local Facebook groups. One, from a retired teacher named Helen, was captioned, "Love comes in strange formats. Some days, the attention felt sweet. Other times, Teresa wanted to hang a sign around her neck that read, 'No, I didn't train them. Yes, it's real.' But all the interpretations missed something. They weren't a joke or an act. There was no punchline. Eloise didn't strut for applause, and Baxter never tried to lead. They were each other's balance, yin and yang in mismatched fur. A slow, quiet equation playing out in steps and pauses and the occasional tail flick of affirmation. Still, the thought crossed Teresa's mind one afternoon as she watched them from the porch. What would happen? Pen if Eloise, for whatever reason, didn't show up? What if one morning she simply wasn't there to lead? The image of it pressed at her. Baxter standing at the door, leash on, eyes stuck on the empty sidewalk, wind blowing across an ordinary path that suddenly felt like too much space. She shook the thought away, because so far, every morning had ended the same. One gray dog shadowing one orange cat, in the rhythm only they understood. The first time Eloise disappeared, it wasn't cause for alarm. Cats, after all, vanish. They have a way of slipping between hours, curling into unseen corners, returning when they feel like it. Teresa assumed she was off inspecting someone's hydrangeas or sleeping on the hood of a sun-warmed car. But by evening, she hadn't returned. The walk that day was short. Baxter, leash on, paused at the door, wagged his tail tentatively, then stepped outside without his guide. For the first 2 houses, he moved forward like she might be leading from a distance, just out of frame. But when the sidewalk kept stretching empty in front of him, something shifted. His feet slowed, then stopped. He looked back, then at Teresa, then at the horizon, and then he sat. It wasn't panic, not barking or whimpering, just a quiet refusal, like a child who forgot how to ride a bike overnight. The next morning, Eloise still hadn't returned. Teresa checked the garage, called neighbors, knocked on familiar doors. No one had seen the smug tabby who held neighborhood court. A boy down the street offered that he might have spotted her slinking into someone's open shed, chasing a moth. Another recalled her, perched on a front porch swing 2 blocks away, whiskers twitching like weather vanes. But no one had seen her come back. Baxter, meanwhile, was fading. He refused breakfast. Not a sniff, not a glance, rested his chin on his paws, and watched the back door like a television, on pause. His eyes didn't track birds. His ears didn't twitch at squirrels. He didn't walk, not solo, not with gentle coaxing or high-value treats. Teresa sat on the floor beside him for long stretches, reading books aloud, like background music for the waiting. She warmed his favorite blanket in the dryer, played the classical guitar station through a dusty speaker. But to Baxter, the cat was gone, and with her, the compass, the rhythm, the one thing that told him the world knew what it was doing. By the third night, he wouldn't sleep in his usual corner. He moved to the front door and lay on the mat, waiting, watching the shape of evening press itself against the glass. Teresa cried once, softly, alone in the laundry room, on the morning of day 4, just after 6 a.m. As light began peeling back the edges of morning, something moved outside. At first, it was nothing more than a ripple at the end of the walkway, where shadows blended into ferns. Then, unmistakably, it was her, waltzing up the walk like she'd been gone 5 minutes, tail high, paws precise, breezing past the begonias like she'd just filed a zoning report. Eloise trotted up to the porch, paused and gave Coat a single, perfunctory lick. Inside, a howl cracked the silence. Not a bark, not a yip, but a low, rising sound of disbelief and deep, aching relief. Baxter erupted, scrambling from the doormat, spinning, trembling, not with fear, but with whatever the opposite of fear was in his language. Teresa opened the door. He didn't bolt. He tiptoed, arms stretched out, as if unsure he was allowed to touch. Eloise met him with one half-lidded glance, then pressed the side of her body against him, slow and deliberate. They stayed like that, him trembling, her pressing. She didn't purr, he didn't lick, but Baxter tucked his head beneath her chin, buried his nose in her shoulder fluff, and sank down beside her. Teresa didn't move. She barely breathed. She would later say the only sound in that moment was the breeze and 2 hearts clicking back together. Later that day, Eloise napped in the sun-drenched corner of the living room. Baxter curled near her, not touching, always careful, but close enough that his shadow overlapped hers. He still didn't eat that morning. Not until she did. They never discussed it, never collided in some giddy reunion, but something, whatever thread had first stretched between them, now pulled tight, in the quiet, like a perfectly tuned string. She yawned. He blinked. She flicked her tail. He flinched, then settled. They didn't need language. They had location, proximity, presence, and presence. For a dog who waited at doors and a cat who strutted through them was the only truth that mattered. It's strange how we measure time when animals are involved, not in birthdays or wall calendars, but in quiet rituals and vanished oddities, like the first time a food bowl goes untouched, or how a leash once needed daily now sits forgotten in the drawer. That year, the walks became landmark posts, threaded through the ranks. A-days. Mornings began with Eloise stepping onto the porch before the sun cut across the driveway. She never waited, just started walking. Baxter, now with a little more spring in his joints, followed without prompting. Teresa kept her distance, no longer leading the process, merely honoring it. They never strayed far. Half the neighborhood knew them now, and some had built tiny routines around spotting their procession. An elderly man waved to them from his rocker, cane resting on the porch rail. A small girl would tap the window until her mother lifted her so she could look outside and shout, "The Queen," and her. Night. Everyone had their name for it. Teresa still said nothing, just walked a few paces behind, hands in her coat pockets, letting them do what they did best, move together. At some point, the local library held a photo contest, and one of the submissions, Eloise and Baxter mid-walk, tails aligned like musical notes, won third place. The librarian called to ask if Teresa would bring them in for a companion animals story hour. She declined. They wouldn't understand fluorescent lights and sticky carpet squares. They understood sidewalks, chirping power lines, and the smell of passing gardenias. They understood pauses and glances. That was enough. Near the end, Teresa noticed Eloise sleeping more in the sunniest corner. She no longer cared to climb to the windowsill or investigate the neighbor's mint patch. The walks grew shorter. Sometimes, she'd only make it to the driveway before settling down, tail flicking once to signal that the journey ended there for today. Baxter would copy her exactly. Straight spine, curled paws, eyes tilted toward her, as if trying to read tiny print off her whiskers. She never meowed. He never barked. Then one Wednesday afternoon, Eloise lay stretched across the porch, sunlight feathering he fur between her ears. Teresa stepped outside with a cup of tea and knew without having to check. Eloise had gone as she had lived, quietly and entirely on her own terms. Baxter approached and lay down beside her, head resting near her front paw, as still as the sky above him. He didn't whine, didn't pace or panic. He just stayed. For hours, Teresa sat nearby and read aloud from a book she never finished, voice soft, pages fluttering. That night, Baxter didn't sleep on his usual mat. He took her spot, the corner where afternoon warmth lingered the longest. His shape curled into hers, as if tracing memory with muss. Clee. The days that followed passed uneventfully. No grand gestures, no breakdowns, but something had shifted. He still walked, not every morning, not with the same purpose, but enough. Sometimes he'd step out alone, pause at the end of the driveway, and stare down the path as if calculating whether it could still carry her shadow. His leash, now mostly decorative, would hang loose in Teresa's hand. He chose the direction. She followed. He stopped more often than he used to, at bushes, at empty porches, at puddles, reflecting sky, places she'd once paused for reasons he hadn't understood, but paused at now as if Greek-er, asping them in retrospect. Over time, the stops got shorter, the silences more restful than searching. Still, every so often, he would wait, not moving, not sniffing, just watching something only he could feel. Perhaps it was memory, perhaps habit, perhaps love. Presence fades, but not entirely. Sometimes, what's left is enough to keep walking. And every once in a while, as Teresa watched the little dog stare off toward a place no longer occupied, she could almost see a tail flick through the air that wasn't there, a compass that once led him from fear into quiet, and now, even in its absence, still pointed forward,